Welcome in Česká spořitelna. I'm super happy that I can see the room full of people, especially in this tricky times. I know that so much people put super much effort for us to meet in here, especially squad coaches. So please put the hands together for all the squad coaches that help us to prepare that. And obviously, I need to thank you also, Hanka Kohankova, to pull this event together. So I'm super happy, like I said, that I can welcome you in Česká spořitelna. As you know, Česká is trying to be as much flexible company, and we have this team of super 50 coaches that are doing their best to be so. Okay, so I have only one rule today. No, two rules. First, if you are staying in this room, please have your mask on. If you are outside, when you have a drink, you don't need to wear a mask. So that's rule number one. Rule number two, I hope that all of you will have a great time. So that's it from me. Karol.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to an annual Prague Scrum Beer event. Yes, that's how long we haven't met each other. It was June last year, I guess, so it's even more than that. Because we are traditionally an offline event and things are as they are right now. So I hope that over the autumn we will have more opportunities to meet in person. I'll be very happy to see you faces, all of them. So thank Česká for hosting this event. It seems to me it's not the last time, but I'm not supposed to know. So today I'm proud to introduce Craig Larman, the co-author of LESS, who is visiting Prague for the LESS conference, which was there last week, and giving a LESS class this week. So he offered us to give us a talk on this. So Craig, the stage is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
I'd like to welcome you here. My name is Craig, and I'm trying to reduce suffering in product development. I want to organize our time together. We'll spend an hour and a half to 2 hours together. And in the first part, I'm going to share some ideas and some thoughts. And then in the second part, we'll do a structured question and answer session for the things that you want to ask. But I want to start by exploring with you the implications of component teams. Now, let's define the term. A component team is when you have a group of programmers that are attached to some pieces of code. There's many synonyms of component team. For example, if you have a team that does a microservice, that's a component team. If you have a team that works on a subsystem, component team. A team that works on an application, component team. A team that works on a platform, a component team. Anytime you've got programmers who work in some subset of the code, and usually associated with this is the idea of private code, it's our code, not yours, you have the concept of component team. So that's the generalizing term. We don't want to get lost in all of the different terminology, which is really just variations of this basic idea. So what? What are the implications of having component teams? So I'd like to start with the question. So imagine we have component teams. Typical example would be like front end, middle tier, microservices, platform, infrastructure team, application team, etc. And then we receive a new idea or a new requirement. And the first question that comes up is, then, who is going to do the understanding of the requirement? Who's going to do the analysis of this requirement if you have component teams? Well, would it be the back-end COBOL team? Would they do the user experience analysis? Seems a bit strange. If you have component teams, Would the middle-oriented middleware team do the business and user experience analysis? Seems a bit strange. So if we have component teams, then instead of the developers doing the business analysis and UX analysis, instead we introduce a specialized role that we could just generalize as analysts. And they're for sure going to create some kind of a document because they're not doing everything end to end. They're doing one step of the creation. And so they're going to create some kind of a document. Now, before we go further, I want you to notice something important, that there's no intrinsic need to have this role, and there's no intrinsic need to have this document. It's a side effect of, first of all, saying we have component teams. And once you put that constraint in place, it gives rise to this idea. Moving on. Another question that comes up is, what components are touched by this requirement? Let's, for example, give it a name and call it F1. In my world, which is large-scale software development, architecturally there might be 500 or 1,000 components. And so when you've got a new requirement coming in, it's not clear what components are touched. If you've got a little tiny product where it's just front-end code, back-end code, it's obvious. But in large applications, self-driving car, banking system, etc., it's much more complex to answer the question. So we need to answer the question, what components are touched by F1? Who's going to answer that question? Which component team is going to answer the question, which component team? So we have a kind of chicken and egg problem. And even if we were to answer that question, like component 6, component 12, component 24, then a related question is, who's going to do some kind of a consistent design that cuts across the 4 components? Will it be the back-end COBOL team? Will it be the front-end JavaScript team? It's not clear. And so once again, this leads to the introduction of another role called, in typically pure software development groups, architects. But in my world, which is often hardware and software, these people are often called systems engineers. And if you've ever worked in this world, you'll often see some kind of a spreadsheet or a table where in one dimension there's the requirements F1, F2, F3, and in the other dimension there's the components C1, C2, C3, and someone's trying to figure out, and you might have even seen that kind of a table filled in a really large scale. And you'll notice that the person who fills it in is not a programmer, it's someone outside of them. And it's important to understand that the apparent need for this role is because you had component teams. Let's move on. And that'll probably go there, and they're probably going to create some kind of a document as well. Now let's suppose that in this particular requirement, ultimately we discover that there's going to be 3 component teams involved in the development. These dots will represent developers in the team. Rhetorical question, can I just give these 2 documents to these teams? And if it's small, large scale, the answer is probably. But if it's huge, large scale, then there's often a lot more specialist expertise involved. And then there's usually some kind of a role that's put in front of this team. I've seen many names for this role over the years. The one I find most sort of funny and interesting is technical business analyst. Even the name is weird. And they'll, for example, take these artifacts and then produce another artifact, which is the work for that component team. Now, interesting point, rhetorical question, does a component team do an end-to-end customer feature? No, they're doing a step. They're doing a task. If we could, I'll use the language of task to not mean a requirement, but a little activity. Key point, if you have component teams, the work that the component teams are doing is not customer requirements, it's component tasks. What's interesting, though, is if you were to ask this team what this is, you know what they might say? Oh, that's a customer requirement. So they can't even see what's going on. They've lost the plot. Now, moving on. The next step of the diagram I could draw, in theory, as follows. But I'm not going to draw it this way, that all the three component teams are making the code together. And I'm not going to draw it this way because it gives the false impression that the code is coming together and being integrated. But that's not true, and I'll explain why. Let's look at this another way. These are the architectural components in the product. And because there's component teams, we got programmers attached to them, like so. This is, for example, F1. And let's say, for example, it goes like that. And so each of these component teams has component tasks once you break it up. But back to the point of why I'm not going to draw the diagram that way is because what's going on in the organization isn't just F1, it's F1 through F100. So this is the real picture of what's going on, right? That's the reality. And therefore, each of these teams doesn't have just one component task. In fact, they have a set of component tasks. And as a consequence, you can perhaps see that one of the problems that arises from this is the prioritization problem. Which of the many component tasks that this team could do, which one do they do first? It's not clear. And so too with all of the other component teams. So in reality, a more accurate way of looking at this model is that there's multiple tasks for all of these single specialist groups all the way down, which is getting us closer to why I'm not drawing the picture, why I'm not drawing the picture this way. Because this picture communicates the idea the code is being integrated and comes together. But let's consider the reality. Imagine it's Monday on 9 a.m. How likely is it that all three teams are working on their component tasks for the same requirement? It's actually not so likely. I've worked in a bank where they had this kind of a model, and they had a layer of managers. They call them demand managers, and they received all the demands from all the business people, and then they shuffle all the priorities across all the component teams in order to try to scratch the itches of the various people complaining. So in that way, the priorities of the different tasks start to get done out of order. That's one reason why the different teams could be working on different component tasks for different requirements at the same time. And that means, that's one reason why you can't think of all the code coming together at the same time because they're not actually working on the code for the same requirement at the same time. A second reason why this picture misrepresents the situation is not only the fact that they could be working on different tasks for different requirements, but the different tasks take different times. This is not manufacturing. It's not like every one of these is exactly 17 person hours. It's not like moving through a systems like stuff on an assembly line. Their task for F1 could be 200 person hours. Their task for F1 could be 20 person hours. And so for both of these reasons, the work starts to get done asynchronously. On Monday morning at 9 a.m., it's really unlikely that they're all working in lockstep on exactly the same related code for exactly the same requirement. Well, what's the implication of that? I work as a programmer, and for those of you who work as programmers, you'll understand my next point. How does programming work when there's component teams? Because we've got component teams, that means we've got private code, which means that this team isn't going to change the code in there. That's this team's responsibility. But because we're per definition talking about software that's talking to other components, this team, they could write a call to this component and to, for example, make a call on operation 1. 9 a.m. Monday, programmer Petter writes code to make a call to operation 1 over here. But because the teams are working asynchronously, either because of the shifting priorities or because of the different lengths of time of the tasks, it's really unlikely that operation 1 is implemented over here. And therefore, key point, they can't integrate the code. Because if you were to try to integrate the code, you would get an integration failure or a link failure. Now, back in the 90s, Kent Beck introduced XP, Extreme Programming. And he invited a group of folks to be the first XP coaches, including myself and a few other people. I'm an old Smalltalk programmer from the 80s, and Kent is a Smalltalk programmer from the 80s, and so I've known him for a while. And so I was able to become one of these first coaches. And so you might or might not know this, but Kent Beck is the person who introduced and popularized the term continuous integration. And so I'm going to explain to you what continuous integration means from the person who introduced the idea as one of the coaches, trying to explain it as it was meant by the people who made up the idea. Some people are surprised to know the meaning of continuous integration. Not everyone knows it. So continuous integration means to integrate continuously. Now, I know that sounds surprising. I go to so many companies and they say, Craig, we're doing continuous integration. And I say, oh, what does that mean? And they say, we have Jenkins. Or some variation. If you don't know, Jenkins is an example of a build server technology. In other words, they've mixed up, or conflated, as we would say in English, they've conflated a build server with a behavior. This is the key point that Kent Beck was making. Continuous integration means to integrate continuously. It's a behavior by programmers. It's got nothing to do with build servers at all. If you're in a group talking about continuous integration and you're talking about build servers, you lost the plot. You can have build servers out the wazoo. You can have millions of build servers running at the speed of light. But if you have a programmer that checks out a piece of code and keeps it checked out for like a really, really long time, like I've seen programmers check out code for an hour before committing, believe it or not. So if you've got if you've got programmers checking out code before committing and merging with everybody else for like an hour delay, you've got delayed integration. You don't have continuous integration. And it doesn't matter what your build servers are doing. All of your programmers are behaving by delaying the integration. And that's the situation that we've got here. We must have delayed integration because we can't integrate continuously. So it's really amusing if I go to a company that has component teams and they say we're doing continuous integration. That's a logical contradiction. You can't be, if you're a programmer and you can understand what's really going on, and as you may or may not know, we have a value in LESS, both Bas Voda, the co-creator, and my friend and me, we work as hands-on programmers. We're not like teachers or consultants, we're hands-on developers. And if you go into the code and really hands-on work with teams, you'll discover the bullshit. When some manager has said, you know, we're a continuous integration environment, when you can see what's really going on. That is delayed integration because you have component teams, because they can't all be working on the same related tasks in lockstep minute by minute, so that when this person writes the call to operation 1, this person a microsecond later starts to write the solution to operation 1. It doesn't work like that at all. And so this code. This is a much more accurate representation of what's going on. Well, at some point, we do have to integrate the code. Who's going to do that? Which of the 9 or 309 component teams is going to be responsible for integrating the code of all of the component teams? After some like really long period of time, like 1 month or 3 months or something like that. And it's not clear, so let's make up another role. So back in the 1970s, we then introduced the idea of what we would call a release manager. And the release manager would take responsibility for making sure that finally all of the code was integrated and comes together. But those of you who work as programmers know that the longer this delay, the more superlinearly there are problems here, because the dynamics of code is that the coupling increases typically superlinearly with the number of lines of code. So the more the delay, the more lines of code, the more problems there will be, which therefore means there will be now unplanned interruptions back into the teams when this happens, which reduces the predictability and effectiveness of your processes, as unplanned variability always does. Moving on, notice that this group can't even really do test first. 25 years ago, Kent Beck introduced test first, which means we don't code and then test, but we write the executable tests first and then write the code afterwards. So the idea for the last 25 years is you write the requirement as an executable requirement, you run it, it fails, and then that executable requirement drives you to make the code. That's why it's called test-driven development. You're driven by the failing executable test. But we can't even do that here. We have to use one of these old-fashioned 1960s approaches. You guys probably haven't heard of this, but you have testers who do testing at the end. This really old-fashioned 60s and 70s practice. So we're kind of forced to introduce testers at the end. Again, notice that all of this is a side effect of having put in the original constraint of having component teams. Again, there will be unplanned interruptions because this won't go smoothly, further degrading the efficiency and predictability of the processes. Moving on, we now have the situation where the work has been chopped up across many single specialists with all kinds of handoff. There's a lot of this work going on in parallel, and we have coordination and tracking problems because you have component teams. It's important to understand that the coordination problems aren't intrinsic. The coordination problems are a self-inflicted wound, which is a side effect of having set up with component teams. What are we going to do? What do we need? We need a new role. What do we call it? We already got release manager. Project manager. Yeah. In fact, in this role, they're not really a project manager. More precisely, they're a coordination manager. But they're usually called project managers. But what they're really doing is coordinating between everybody and tracking and so forth. Okay, let's move on. Now, before I come back to this, I want to pause, shift, bring up a new idea, and then come back. And the idea I want to bring up is, what is the goal of your organizational system? For example, one goal could be lowest possible lead time. Another possibility could be working on highest value. Another one could be increasing adaptiveness or agility. That means the ability to change direction cheaply and easily without any effort. Another possible goal is secrecy between the workers, so that worker 1 and worker 2 know very little about what each other are doing, and there's very low learning between the workers. This is useful, for example, if you're doing an intelligence or defense product. Another one could be to maximize busyness of workers, which might sound strange, but there are countries where I've worked, India and China, where essentially the strategic goal was to give lots of people work to avoid social unrest. They weren't doing anything useful, but it just kept them busy. So you might wonder why that would happen, but that kind of thing happens. Now, key point, I'd like to suggest there's no good or bad goal for an organization. I'm not moralizing here about what's desirable or undesirable. But what is, I think, relevant is that your organization can choose a goal and then demonstrate that the organizational design is consistent with that goal. That seems like a reasonable idea. So that if the organization says, for example, our goal is agility or low lead time, then we should be able to demonstrate that it's consistent with those things. So when we look at this system, I could ask the question incorrectly. I could ask the question, is this a good or a bad org design? It's a wrong question because it's not good or bad, that's just moralizing. But a more interesting question is what it's consistent with. So, for example, do you think that this org design is associated with the lowest possible lead time? Absolutely not. And there's several ways that we can answer that question. One is simply empirically. You could go to companies, start your watch, and if people could put their phones on silent if they're not, and start your watch and just observe that on average it takes a long time for something to get through this organizational system. Another way of analyzing it from the point of view of lead time is abstracting this through queuing theory. If you understand some basics of queuing theory, if you have, these represent servers in a queue, those can be people or teams. If you have a sequential process with handoff to downstream servers, first of all, note that there will be a queue in front of each of these servers. fact, then the average total time through this system will increase superlinearly with each additional server and queue in the system, not linearly. So suppose, for example, it's a 2-queue system, and on average, it takes 2 months for something to go from the beginning to the end. You go to a 3-queue system, it doesn't take 3 months, it takes, for example, 8 months. Superlinear. 4 queues, 27 months. 5 queues, 74 months. It's this superlinear dynamic. And that's another way that you can analyze this, because that's exactly what this case is. So there's several ways that you can see that it's not consistent with low lead time. I'll come back to highest value in a moment. Let's stay on adaptiveness for a moment. Now, what does adaptiveness mean? It means that you can change direction cheaply. There's a saying in English, to turn on a dime. A dime in Canada, where I'm from, in the US, is a small coin. So to turn on a dime means that you can turn with a lot of agility. And so a saying, turn on a dime for a dime. Can you change direction cheaply? Does it cost almost no effort? It takes no time for the whole group to change direction. So imagine we have this system, we put something in the front, you crank the engine, and then after, let's say, 5 months, something starts to come out the other end. And you've got hundreds of people here, all kinds of work in progress, and then 5 months in, you say, stop everything. We have brand new ideas that we didn't anticipate before. Wind down all of your existing work so it's not a mess, and then take on these new requirements. Do you think that this organization will complete that in 1 day so that 1 day later they're delivering the new requirements? No, it's going to take forever before they can actually shift and actually deliver for this new unanticipated direction. So this is very inconsistent with agility or adaptiveness. Let's take high value. Imagine we have a list of requirements. And imagine they were sorted by value, whatever that means. I'll abstract that complex question for the moment. Because we're talking about multiple components involved, we could ask and answer the question, what components are touched by requirement 1? For example, what requirements are touched by number 2? And so on, number 33. Let me focus on number 33, and it touches component C17. Imagine in this thought experiment that this is the first requirement that touches C17. It can happen. Now, imagine this group, which says they're going to work by customer value. Imagine that they do serious estimation, really due diligence, the best that they can do, and they estimate best case 6 months before they start on number 33, best case. Now imagine it's day 1 of this company, and the CEO comes to the development group, and she goes to the room where the C17 developers work on day 1. And she opens the door to their room, nobody there. So then she goes to the manager of the C17 group on day 1 of this story and says, hey, where are the C17 programmers? And he says, well, we estimate that it's going to be at least 6 months before it's time for them to do their component task on number 33, so I've asked them to go on vacation until it's time for them to come in and do their task. So does she say, wow, that's a great idea. I don't think so. So she says, on day one, I expect them to be what? Busy. And on day one, what is that team working on? They're working on number 33. And so too with all of the component teams, microservice teams, application teams, subsystem teams. They're not working on highest value. They're working on something that will keep them busy. Everyone's working on what can be quite low value, focusing on busyness. Another point, by the way, suppose that in reality, it's going to take them 20 person hours to do this task, and then there's another 4 months before there's another real task for them to do on a requirement. What do they do in between? They have to make stuff up, right? Because they're probably even measured on outputting code. So that means that they're going to make stuff up and make more code, make their components and microservices more complicated unnecessarily. And then, wow, our component is getting more complicated. We need another developer. And so then you hire another developer, and now you have a reinforcing loop, which is making the problem even worse. So now a product that maybe could have been done with 25 great developers has 3,000 developers in it 17 years later because of the dynamic of how this plays out. So as a consequence, where's my, oh, it must be the next page. Oh yeah, here it is. So as a consequence, it's not consistent with working on high value. It's not consistent with low lead time. It's not consistent with adaptiveness. And I hope you can see this is not a religious argument. I'm doing just logical analysis, thinking through this very slowly. It is consistent with busyness, and because people are not learning from each other, it's consistent with secrecy, or therefore low learning, low knowledge sharing. So if your goal of your company is minimizing learning between people, and the goal of your company is that they keep busy working on low value, then having component teams is a consistent organizational design. And what's funny is that I've gone to many managers and they're set up like this, and I ask them, what are your goal? What are you doing in your organization? You know what they say? Craig, we're an agile organization focused on fast time to market, delivering highest value. I've literally heard that. So the managers have no ability to even analyze and comprehend what's going on in their organizational designs. And it doesn't matter what label you call them, microservice teams, application teams, any kind of a team associated with chunks of code generates these dynamics. So it's really funny when I hear organizations claim that they're agile when they're based upon component teams. This is not an argument about what's right or wrong or good or bad. It's just a logical analysis. Well, that's the bad news of the story. But the good news is that this group then decides to go to get some education for learning how to change their organizational design and then apply some kind of, I don't know, McKinsey scaling agile approach or something like that. And they come back and they go through a deep transformation in which they've really fixed the root cause problems and everything has been changed. Here's the new organizational design. So first step in this deep transformation is to introduce a new role called product owner. Then they introduce a new artifact called epics. They introduce another new role in the deep transformation called agile architects who create architectural epics. The next step in the deep transformation is that they introduce team product owners who create stories. Another part of the radical transformation is that they introduce Scrum teams. Of course, they also introduce DevOps as part of this deep change. And of course, they also have Agile testers and Scrum Masters. And now they've introduced scaling Agile, and they've transformed the organization so now they are consistent with low lead time, working on highest value in an Agile organization. And I can't tell you how many times I have seen this. I've gone around the world, and for the last 25 years, I've seen this again and again and again. And the core reason is called Larman's laws. Why is this happening? And they're called Larman's laws. If you Google it, you can find them. I'm going to paraphrase, but going by memory. Law number 1, organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for managers and single specialists. Organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for managers and single specialists. It's implicit because you're never going to find a poster on the wall that says, status quo for the managers. But when you see this bullshit, you can clearly see what's going on. And you're all young. I've been doing this since the 1970s. This is my 8th change fad in software development. So you can't imagine how many times I've seen this just with different jargon every time. It's always the same thing. It's just the jargon names change, but the patterns remain the same. That's number 1. Organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for managers and single specialists. Number 2, as a corollary to number 1, corollary means a follow-on consequence. As a corollary to number 1, any change initiatives, terminology will be reduced and overloaded to mean some variation of the status quo. Let me repeat that. Number 2, as a consequence of number 1, the new change ideas, terminology, and jargon will be redefined to mean a minor variation of the status quo. We see that here. Number 3, as a corollary of number 1, any change initiative will be criticized as purist, theoretical, religious, and needing pragmatic customization for local concerns. Now, this is a very tricky mental judo move. You know, for example, imagine that you're a Scrum Master and you're in an organization using project management. As I'm sure you know, the whole concept of projects is inconsistent with agility and adaptiveness. So, and imagine this organization has a PMO, a project management group. And the head of project management wants to learn about Scrum. And so the Scrum Master goes and meets with him. And he says, so can you explain Scrum to me? And so the Scrum Master explains, well, Scrum implies continually adapting based upon learning in new directions and therefore is inconsistent with having projects. And in Scrum, therefore, there's no need for a project manager at all. And so the head of the PMO says, oh, that's a religious approach to Scrum. We need a pragmatic customization, which is really code for it wouldn't be pragmatic for the project managers and other managers to change their positions. So we're going to change the change instead of the managers and specialists changing. And it's a weird trick because they turn it around as though it's the change agent's fault. You know, like as though the change agent is being a radical crazy when they're just saying the definition. It's a real bullshit move. So watch out for that one. That's number 3. Number 4, as a corollary of number 1, if when the change is introduced, unfortunately, some managers and single specialists are really displaced, they move into the change center of excellence and become the coaches and trainers of the change idea. reinforcing number 1, 2, and 3. And then you get this endless loop of fake change in organizations. And that, in a nutshell, is why you get this endless change fads and bullshit agile Scrum adoptions all around the world. Yeah, I think that's enough. Time for a sip of beer. Each pair or triplet, I will assume that one person is the question owner. And my next step will be directed only to the question owners. Are there any question owners born in the month of January? Okay. February. Is there a question owner born in the month of February? What happens here minus 9 months in Czechia? January, February, March. Any question owner born in March? There we go.
So the question over here is how do...
You can take down the mask.
Okay. So the question here is, from your experience, how do those various component teams perceive this, setups? I mean, like in terms like if they don't know anything, else, so they are living in this world, and they would like, would like to know what are those top 3 concerns, like, if this happening or if this about, going to change, like, what are their concerns, with changing this setup?
If I understand your question correctly, just let me test my understanding. You're asking, what are the component team's concerns if we change the organizational design?
Yeah, if they are about to do so.
I'm going to answer the question in a slightly different way than you might expect. First of all, because of Larman's first law, that organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for managers and single specialists, they don't want to make any change. Like, it's very important to understand if you're involved in deep change, nobody wants to do it. And you're a fantasist if you think the 1,000 people in your group actually want to change. They don't. They want to maintain in their comfortable status quo. So almost always you can't make any deep change. I observe over the last 40 years that the worldwide market for deep change is almost zero. In other words, the worldwide market for real Scrum is almost zero. The worldwide market for these kinds of fake changes is just enormous. And then everyone can maintain in their status quo, but use new jargon and then pretend to be part of the change fad. That's one comment. Another comment is, if you force change onto people, you will fail. And young and naive change agents think that you can, and a lot of senior managers who are very naive and inexperienced in change, incorrectly think that they can command change. But if you become, as I become, a student or an expert on organizational change dynamics, lesson 1 is that people have to want to change, not have to change. People have to own the idea and eagerly want it. And if you try to take this organization and tear it all up and reorganize it, and the people in it don't eagerly want to do it, it's going to be a disaster. So if you've got all these component teams that are asking questions about the concerns, you're already failed. Because how successful change works is that the people are beating down your door to do this deep change. They so desperately and eagerly want it. And if you don't have that, you're fucked. You're not going to be able to do this. So a couple of comments building on this. We suggest, and this is not an idiosyncratic recommendation from Bus and I, but you'll see this if you study the change literature. Do a deep change in a small part at a time. We recommend around 50 people. Your product group might be 5,000 people, but you need to start with 50 people where the deep change happens, and the other 9,500 people are remaining in the old model. And for those 50 people, you want them to only join by volunteering if they can demonstrate thorough knowledge of every implication of the change, understand the why, and deeply want to do this. A while ago, I was working in Madrid, and I met an Agile coach who did essentially this, 50 people, volunteers, and more precisely, he was like a guard at the door to the new organization. And each of the 50 people spent like an hour or 2 hours with him one-on-one, and they had to convince him that they really understood everything about the new approach, that they really wanted to join this desperately. And it's really only in that context you're going to have a successful deep change. And I'm talking about deep change here. I'm not talking about these shallow, fake changes. And the implication of that is that you can either do an agile transformation in a bank with 3,000 people all at once, and it's all just basically fake. The names have changed and some minor trivial practices have changed, but deep change hasn't happened. Or you can do slowly 50 people at a time over 10 years. But of course, as you probably know, what's driving a lot of this is managers' incentives to have on their CV, I have led a change initiative. You might naively think that your senior managers actually care about this. I work with C-level management all the time. They don't. They're playing the careerism game, because to move to the next level in the executive career track, you have to have on your CV, I have led a change initiative. So any moderately intelligent executive is aware of what the current change fad is in the market. They attach themselves to it. You think that they actually really care, but they're really playing the careerism game. So what's driving this is really just a lot of careerism by managers. And in that context, they're not going to want slowly 50 people done skillfully and effectively over 10 years, because that's not good for their career. And so instead we get these big, I led the 3,000 person agile change at the bank, and then she's got a huge number of job opportunities in the market. That's what's really going on. Sorry to burst your bubble. Now, was there another March baby? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm not sure that maybe what you said maybe kind of answered our question. That was the major one. The question was how to get out of this. And to be more specific, how to persuade the people who don't want to change, if I simplify it. Or maybe if I can elaborate, how to work with the people who are very like pro-agile, but actually want to just rename the things.
In my experience, you can't. A variation of the question is, how do you get the senior managers to blah, blah, blah? You can't. Let me know. And I've been doing this for, decades and decades. Ken Schwaber's a colleague of mine. I know a lot of the old timers in this world. Every one of them will tell you, you can't. It's just a complete waste. It's a fool's errand. Either your company is in an existential crisis and has a real sense of urgency, and then the senior leadership go like, oh shit, we really need to change or we're going to die. That's why this is a good time to do this work in automotive. Because, Mercedes, Audi, BMW, they know that they're screwed if they can't create a self-driving car. It'll be the end of their businesses. It's an existential crisis. So finally, the C-level management in these companies gets the humility to say, we don't know what we're doing, but we know that we're going to have to make a really deep change. I observe that most companies have too much money. And that's why in all of my years and decades, I have never once seen a real deep change in financial services. in banking or insurance. I've only ever seen variations of this because there's way too much money in financial services. So anything that would actually challenge the status quo of all of the managers who are creaming off that wonderful cash from the banking industry, there's no way that they actually want to, disrupt their happy paths.
Thanks. We
Yeah.
tried the way with no money, but that's why 3 of us here have a new employment now because
Yeah.
the
And
company haven't survived.
what's funny, sad. I'm here in the front of the room, and I'm hearing these questions from you. 5 years ago, same story, different faces. 10 years ago, exactly same questions. 15 years ago, exactly same questions. 25 years ago, same questions. It's just for the last 40 years, I've just seen exactly the same thing with the same questions and the same faces and the same kinds of people that go through this again and again. Because many of the people involved in change have a kind of optimism, but they're often naive and don't understand what's really going on at the senior management levels in organizations. Okay, April, an April baby. May. June.
I will have a slightly modified of our original question. Is how do you get people to even volunteer and be interested in that small bubble of 50 people?
Let me know. No, seriously. Yeah. I've heard this question 1,000 times over decades, and I've never seen, I don't know anyone who's ever seen an answer. Most people in change are in a fantasy. You're not going to change. It's just a game. Get real. And just focus on something simple like helping them how to make clean code. That you can do. Yeah. That was June, right?
We have one more.
June.
Thank you. Hi, what a pleasure. We have a technical question. How do you motivate the component team that works on the priority 33 to be excited to work on the priority number 2 if they don't know how to do it?
Well, not only is it hard to get them excited, it's impossible to get them excited because there is no C17 component on number 2. So you can't solve this problem if you have component teams. It's completely impossible. The only way that you could solve this problem is if you eliminated all of the component teams, microservice teams, platform teams, application teams, and transformed into end-to-end feature teams that work across the entire code stack. Point 1. Point 2, back to the motivation. If you look into the research in industrial psychology of what motivates people at work, one of the elements is meaning or a sense of purpose. And human psychology, one of the ways that humans get a sense of purpose or meaning at work is by being connected to real customers who are really consuming the thing that you're creating. And this is very much in the engineering mindset. If you're an engineer, what turns you on is to make something, have the person use it, and then say, wow, that's great, or feedback, that sucks, and you could make it better this way. Or it really solves a problem for the person. That creates a sense of meaning. Of course, these component teams can never have that sense of meaning because they're not creating something for the end customer. They're just making an intermediate artifact. What could potentially introduce the context in which people had an intrinsic motivation to care is if they were in a team that was working end-to-end, real problem solvers with autonomy to truly deliver something of impact. And without that context, it's just not going to happen. I will use that as an excuse to bring up law number 5, Larman's law number 5. It is culture follows structure. Culture follows structure. What that means is that you cannot change culture directly. And you can quickly spot a very inexperienced, naive change person if they ever say, this is a culture change. They have no experience. You can't change culture directly. For example, to take this as an example, you go to, this component team is in southern China. They work on, component 13. They've never been face-to-face with a real customer in Czechia or wherever. They're just making their code for this little intermediate part. And you go to them and you say, you should care about the customer. It's a culture change. It's a fantasy because the organizational design, the structure is completely inconsistent with what you're asking them to care about. It's like, as another example, imagine you've got project managers and imagine that they get measured on the success of their projects. And then, of course, as you know, they play all of these bullshit games called green shifting, in which they distort the information about what's really going on, because that's what they're getting measured and rewarded on. And you go to them and naively saying, hey, you should be transparent. It's a culture change. When in 3 weeks, they've got a performance review with their person to see if their projects are on time and on budget. It's a fantasy. Until you get rid of the concept of projects and project managers, there's no way that you're going to have transparency, because systemically, the organizational system is signaling this way. Really, the generalization is the system creates the culture. It's not that the culture creates the system. Now, that actually depends whether we're talking about a startup or a large company. The story of companies, imagine you're 3 people in a little office in a startup. In that case, it's the opposite. It's not culture follows structure, it's structure follows culture. If you're 3 people in a little startup, the informal organizational design you have will reflect the people's values in that little room. And I've worked in a startup. Anyone worked in a startup that went like from 5 people to 100 people? Okay, so you might have had the feeling of one day walking down the hallway, and for the first day you saw someone whose face you didn't recognize. I remember that. I don't know if you recognize that. So if you're in a startup, you've got that structure follows culture dynamic. The informal structures you're setting up reflect your values and cultures. 10, 20 people, 40 people, 75 people, and then I come to work and I get an email and it says, hi, I'm the newly hired HR manager and I'd like to talk to you about your career path. And then it starts to flip. And then 5 years, 10 years pass, you're 3,000 people, and now the structures and organizational design become the dominant forces. They become kind of baked in, and then that becomes the dominant force, which is now signaling and communicating what the culture is. And now the culture follows the structure. And if you want to change the culture, you're going to have to start by fixing the structure first. A digression, but it built on that point. July. Yes, we got several Julys here.
So I will reiterate on the questions that we have, because you answered some of them. Probably everybody has there, like how to get the C-level management to buy in the change. So let's say that we managed to change the structure of a big company. We managed to create the teams organized around features, and we actually do start doing the agility as it is. So how can we protect this structure from falling down back to the component teams and to the specialists and to the managers?
Let me know.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, the only way it can be protected is if it's led by the senior managers who themselves own this idea and want this idea. This is why bottom-up change or middle-up change doesn't work, because the people at the top actually control the levers of power and control the levers of organizational design. So they can fuck it up like that if they want to. So unless your senior leadership are themselves the ones who deeply grasp these ideas, are the ones who themselves create these ideas, it won't be sticky. Now, let me double click on that point. So I suggest avoiding all consulting companies, and I suggest avoiding all agile coaches when you're talking about change. Why? Because, if, for example, if you studied the work of Dr. Cotter at Harvard, a worldwide expert on organizational change, or from my experience, one of the keys for successful sticky change is that the change comes from within. To quote, I'm now paraphrasing Cotter, but this is pretty close to a quote. He said, "I know what I wouldn't do for a deep change. I wouldn't use McKinsey." And he said that literally. And his generalization is, don't have any outside consultants. He says, the change must come from within. So the way that I work with companies is that I will only work with a company if the senior leadership team agrees to and eliminates all consultants from the company. Number one. I mean consultants about organizational design. I'm not talking about a testing consultant or whatever. So no McKinsey, no Accenture, no management consultants. All of those are eliminated. And the senior leadership are themselves the ones that do all the learning, themselves the one that figure out that this is inconsistent and what is consistent. The senior management themselves, without listening to anyone else, create the new organizational design. And then the senior managers are the ones who themselves, not delegating to a change group, but the C and C-1 themselves lead the deep change. And if you do that, then there's a good chance the change will be sticky because they're the ones who have put it in place and they own it. And if they rent it from McKinsey or whatever, then it's just going to become part of this change fad dynamic replaced by something else in 5 years.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
I know that Les is doing certifications, courses for the management and executives. So is this like a step to get them bought in to support the change, or how successful are these?
That's more like lightweight awareness or lightweight education. When I work inside of a company, it's in a long workshop where the C-1 team themselves go through the thinking of systems thinking and organizational design. And there was a few more July babies. Yeah.
You already replied to all our questions, so maybe one question. You said you want management to avoid all external consultants, but
related to management and org design.
But you are sort of one of them, right?
Well, there's a, as we would say in English, there's a priming the pump problem. Mm-hmm. I want to have the senior leadership themselves become experts in systems thinking and organizational design. So I want them to get rid of me as fast as possible. My ideal case is I work with a team for 5 days, I leave the company, and if I ever have to come back, I failed.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. This branching slightly, I recommend that people who are coaches and consultants be financially independent. And I mean this seriously. So for most people, I recommend you don't start until you're in your 50s or 60s when you don't need to work for money. Why? Because, so like, for example, I can make a living as a programmer, et cetera, and I'm financially independent. I don't have to work for a living, and I haven't for a very long time. And if you have people like that, then they can speak with your senior management plainly without any concern for bullshitting in order to keep a job. They can just say what needs to be said. And that's a far more powerful place to be for effective change. Another July baby. Yeah.
So we are in discussing with Les.
Let's, it's for the recording.
Yeah, it's for the recording.
Yeah.
So we are on descaling with Les. So how can actually Les help us to decrease the misery of the product development?
Les really is consistent with adaptiveness. Just to set this up, And who can suffer? The developer can suffer, the customer can suffer, the CFO can suffer. Let's say really important roles that can suffer. So why does the customer suffer? Because we make crap products. Why do we make crap products? Because we have this. And if, on the other hand, we had end-to-end feature teams, which were really connected to the customer, stronger feedback loops, much more adaptiveness based upon learning, there's a slightly greater probability that we'll create something that will really delight the customer, so that the customer is getting more what they want. The developer, if you look at what creates motivation at work, a classic book on this is called Drive, but there's many others. What creates motivation at work is autonomy, number one, and in Less and in Scrum, one of the basic principles is self-managing and self-organizing teams, so nobody tells the developers or teams what to do, so it ticks that box. The second is the opportunity for challenge and mastery. And if you're in a single function team, then you've got very, very low opportunities for challenge and mastery, because the only thing you get to do is be a component 3 programmer for the next 10 years, or if you're lucky, a component 4 programmer. So the challenge level is really low. On the other hand, in a feature team, the job titles also change to just product developer. We get rid of titles like tester and programmer and so forth, and officially everyone's job title changes to product developer. And the career path is different skills. You get more money for more different skills. And the organizational idea then is to provide lots of money and education and coaching for people to develop in different ways. Heck, someone whose primary skill as a programmer might have always really loved the idea of human interaction design and want to learn more about it. Well, now in a feature team, they can do that without any problem. In the traditional model with single function titles and single function groups, almost impossible to do that, except if they have to go through the complicated process of trying to get rehired into a different position. So it supports challenge and mastery. And then third, as I already mentioned, a sense of meaning or purpose. And if you're in a team in which you can create end-to-end solutions, directly interact with real paying customers, get feedback from them and try to improve your product based upon that feedback, for engineers, that gives some sense of meaning at work. So that's for the developer, reducing suffering. CFO, well, this one is a little bit more probabilistic, but a couple of points. I observe that if you have component teams, the organization typically needs around 10 times as many developers as if you were in feature teams, because of the massive waste associated with this model. So that means you could either dramatically reduce your headcount or have people working on more different products, which could either reduce costs or, in the best case, increase revenues by more people delivering more impact. So that's a thumbnail sketch. That was July. Any more for July? August. We have August here and August there. Hi.
Hi. So I was thinking in this scenario, I'm a very big fan of AI. And because we have this model that resulted in companies where you have 500 plus developers, while you could have 25 really good ones that they could do the same job if they would be in a feature team. And Less being a framework that helps to optimize for adaptiveness, effectively leading to fewer roles and potentially people. Do you think AI is going to help you in this direction as well in the future? Because we'll be able to replace developers, if I can say like that out loud? And will that lead actually for companies to reduce the amount of people? What do you see is happening?
So first of all, my graduate work is in AI, so it's my specialty, and I've been very enthusiastic about it for decades. Second, until 2 months ago, I would have answered the question differently. But as you probably know, GPT-3 has led to Codex, OpenAI Codex, and now GitHub Copilot. And this is a breakthrough technology in the best case. In my 40-year career, I would say that OpenAI Codex is one of the most noteworthy, potentially breakthrough technologies that I have seen. And if we view the journey of the developer as moving up the abstraction layer, I started my work as an assembly programmer on mainframes, moving from quite low levels of abstraction to higher and higher levels. If you've seen, Copilot or OpenAI Codex, you can now type in, write the code to initialize PyTorch. And because Codex is a learning machine that knows all of GitHub, it will generate the code for you. Now, it's not even in beta yet. It's not even alpha yet. So we're not sure how far it will go. But because it's GPT-3 is trained against open source GitHub, competitors will also get this idea and create a competitor to Copilot. And the combination of the power of current deep learning machines with the GPT-3 or GPT-4 architecture, with Codex, I think we could be in close to a step change in what developers are doing. And I doubt that it will lead in any short term to a reduction of headcount. It'll more likely lead to an acceleration of making more impact, as has been the usual trend of developers. People will just be able to get more done within the existing time unit, but not in a 5% way. In the best case, Copilot will be an order of magnitude way. At the very least, I think Copilot will radically reduce learning effort for developers. Imagine I don't know some library in Python. Well, with Open Codex, I can interact with it like a kind of teacher, if you will, and really accelerate in the least case. And in the best case, just generate all kinds of code for me where I'm speaking at a level of intention rather than at a lower level. So I'm very excited. However, I've seen promises of technology then fall flat when you really try to push it to the industrial strength. So we'll see. But given what GPT-3 can do with natural language, which is pretty damn impressive, I think it will actually be impressive.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another August baby.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to ask, where have you seen the best pureless adoption in large organization? And if you can mention what were the main points that support this change? You mentioned a number of, let's say, good ideas.
Yeah, the problem is, this is the reason why I was getting a little frustrated thinking about this, is that I have a couple in my mind where the leader left. And then the new guy comes in and he said, "Where's the architecture team? Where's the project managers?" And then destroyed this gem of an organization and took it back to the beginning. So as of today, I now can't give a living example. There's a set of secret Larman's laws. There's the 5 public ones, and there's a set of secret ones. So don't tell anybody. This isn't being recorded, is it? Larman's law number 91. Any great, successful, deep change will be destroyed within 7 years. And this is because of the senior management treadmill that comes in and out. Yeah, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. I've just never seen more than 7. Yeah. But taking the question back a little bit, what were the preconditions for the times when they were successful? It's now predictable. Number 1, there was a sense of urgency, which isn't always existential crisis, but like severe competition or something like that. There was a real sense of true urgency. And number 2, the senior management were themselves the one that did the learning and led the change rather than delegating it to somebody else. Oh, and it was done small, focused and small, typically. But I want to, actually, before I leave this point, I don't care about less. The goal is not for companies to adopt less. I could care less. The goal isn't even adaptiveness for me. My interest is in making a great product that customers love. Now, the problem is that you can't go find a web page that has on it what we need in that product. Right? We don't know a priori what the great product will be. Hell, study Apple. You think they get it right the first time? They go through hundreds and hundreds of cycles based upon feedback and learning. And they're real experts at this, but they still go through hundreds of cycles of feedback and change and learning in order to create a great product. So what I really care about is creating a great product. Now, how do you create a great product since we can't speculate it? That means we need learning loops. If we want learning loops, if each loop is expensive, if the transaction cost of the loop is high, if the ability to change direction is high, then the learning loop model is really painful and broken. And so we're led to adaptiveness, not for its own sake, but as a way to cheaply learn our way to creating a product that customers love. And less is simply an organizational design that supports adaptiveness. I don't really care about less per se, but adaptiveness. I don't even really care about adaptiveness per se. That's my logic. And that was August, right? September. Please.
So also I guess that you answered most of the question. So I'm making you the difficult one. What is in the SOVRA system?
In the what system?
In the overall system, let's say in the society system that induces that kind of company.
This kind?
Yes.
It's not the society, I believe. It's evolutionary psychology. So why this is an example to generalize of what can be called local optimization. And why do we see local optimization and why do we see fear of change and maintaining the status quo? It's because of evolutionary forces. And as I'm sure you understand, our bodies and brains, brain is part of body, our brains did not evolve for this world. You know, all the selection pressures of Darwinian evolution were basically mating, getting food, not being eaten by the big thing for 3 billion years. There's 3 billion years of evolution that has created the mind for that. And then in 50 years, our minds created for that are in a world where we're trying to figure out large-scale software development with software developers. So the thinking mistakes, the cognitive biases, our emotional mechanisms are cavemen in a modern context. And I think that's largely what it is. In fact, to broaden the point, Why do we see so much conflict in societies? At a very deep level, it's evolutionary psychology dynamics.
Should we study more the anthropological studies?
I don't think that would help, because for the people in the middle of it, they don't care. Like, hey, you don't want to change, read a book on evolutionary psychology. Not going to help. And it's September, right? September babies. One at the back.
Hi. One question regarding team size and skills needs to have a really end-to-end team, especially when you have really complex product, which requires a lot of technology. If there is some, let's say, virtual limit of team size, that doesn't make a sense to still have end-to-end team, and when not. And asking about your experience or recommendation how to approach this situation.
Yeah. So there's several ways that I know of to approach this problem, which is can be an intrinsically difficult problem. The first is, do you need so many technologies? So before trying to, put a Band-Aid on the problem, if the root cause is many different technologies, do you really need that many? There are cases where the answer is yes, but having seen many architectures, most often the answer is no. It's a side effect of mergers and acquisitions, technical debt, fads, management not willing to pay down the work of the past. And so you've got 6 different programming languages and 106 different frameworks, not because you needed to, but just because. And if that's the case, then the way to solve the problem isn't to get more teams involved, it's to reduce the number of different technologies in the product. And I would say more than half of the time, more than 3/4 of the time, that's the straightforward path. But then, because I work, and Bus has worked in really, really big systems, like telecom systems, like LTE and so forth, there are cases where it's just sort of intrinsic that there are too many technologies for a team of 7, 8, or 9 people to master everything. And then there's several possibilities related to the statistical patterns of how often this comes up. Like, for example, if it comes up frequently, then it might be, if your team is currently 7 people, it would be an argument for the team to go to 9 people, where the 2 other people know 2 more of the technologies. As you know, at some point, a team is no longer a team because the communication pathways between people increases superlinearly with the number of people involved, not linearly. And so at some point, you don't really have a cohesive team talking together. They kind of bifurcate into 2 teams. Like, there's no such thing as a team of 15 people. That's just a group. But you might be able to solve the problem by bumping up the team size. That's one approach. If it's relatively rare, another approach is handoff, which is that essentially you've now got 2 teams that are not feature teams, but they're cross-component teams. And one team can do 6 of the technologies in the top end of the stack, and another team can do another 6 of the technologies in the bottom end of the stack. Now, this will introduce component team dynamics, because we're now really talking about component teams. But if it's infrequent, then it's not a significant problem in terms of the dynamics of the organization. And a variation of that is, well, to pick up on, I was going to say tooling. can you increase the use of tooling and decision support and automation to solve this problem? And things like Copilot take us in this direction now, where with tools we can move into technologies more that previously we didn't know well and learn them more quickly. Another way that you can sometimes reduce this problem, and this is back to statistical patterns, is that if you look at the typical requirements, they often flow through predictable sets of components. And these kinds of requirements go through there, these kinds of requirements typically go through there. And then if you create feature teams that are crafted around the typical patterns of use, then sometimes also you can reduce the number of components touched. Again, now we're talking about average cases, to reduce it in the average case, and then take the hard cases in hard ways. When there's no neat solution, and it's only one time out of 50 that you've got the hard case, then solve it with handoff to other partial specialist teams. That question's one of those interesting, difficult questions for which there's no neat solution. Most of the other answers I've given actually have neat solutions if you had the willingness to try them. This one has no neat solution. So let me open this question up to other people. Do anyone else have partial solutions to this sort of intrinsically difficult problem? Okay. Yes. Did you have a suggestion? Yeah, I wanted to share like what we do. Ah, okay. On this question, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so in our case, we have like the wide code base and variety of technologies. So we mostly do what you mentioned. It's like teams try to optimize around some areas of functionality. But also I think what really helps is often it's not about team not able to absorb new component or new technology. It's just it's harder to do it under pressure. So it's about how you learn to do it in a way that, you know, helps team to do this more effortless. And that's about, for example, using traveling when team invites certain specialist to visit them for one sprint. And they work on this technology and the person helps to absorb this knowledge faster, or pair with some other team who are experts and again work on some epic together.
Yes.
So it's important to mention that often it seems that amount of technology is an obstacle, but if you do learning in an effective way, so that helps to do it better
absolutely.
and reduce the stress.
I was thinking of starting my answer at that place, but that's kind of the obvious place. So I wanted to assume that the problem wasn't learning, but it was a more deep, intractable problem. And picking up on your comment about learning and pressure, that's a simple problem. Like if the leadership wanted to, they could remove the pressure because that's just an artificial construction. And so that's an easily solvable problem. We're finished with September. Any other Septembers? We're on to October. November. And last December. All right. So now I'll just open it up for 2 or 3 more questions. If anyone has a burning question, I'd like to invite them and then we'll close it off. Done. Thank you for your time.